Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Pete Timmerman. I'm the director of the Webster University Film Series. I'd like to do an introduction of the film series and what we do and who we are before we get into the presentation. Tonight, of course, we've got Aaron Aubuchon doing a presentation on House by the Cemetery. We'll get to Aaron in 5 minutes, hopefully, maybe more if I get to talking too much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Whoa. Here we go. So the Webster University Film Series is St. Louis's only year-round nonprofit movie theater. We've been in operation for about 42 years at this point, actually a little bit longer, but we've only officially been the film series for 42 years. It was a student film society prior to that. But under normal circumstances, we show movies in person in the Winifred Moore Auditorium, which is in Webster Hall on Webster University's main campus in St. Louis, Missouri. That's a picture of Winifred Moore right there. Well, it's a picture of the audience in Winifred Moore anyway. But yeah, under normal circumstances, we show movies in person. Of course, we haven't been doing that though with the pandemic on. So we're a little over 13 months at this point without doing anything in person at all. So of course, like everyone else, to the extent that we can, we've pivoted virtually. So one thing we've been doing is we're holding a virtual cinema where I book a lot of the films that I would have liked to have booked in person virtually, to where you just rent them at home. It's usually like $10 or $12 and we get half the proceeds. So it helps us keep the lights on while keep the lights off, as I've been saying, while we've been closed for the pandemic. But yeah, this is our webpage, webster.edu/film series. It gives you a listing of everything we have available. So tonight we've got two movies closing, the French fiction film Slalom and the American kind of documentary experimental narrative hybrid Mothne Towards the Ocean, Towards the Shore. We've got one more week on the Norwegian fiction film Hope, which was shortlisted for Best International Film at the Oscars, but it didn't quite make the nominees. And then tomorrow we've got one new film opening. It's a new Congolese documentary called Downstream to Kinshasa. But yeah, that one opens tomorrow. We tend to open a film or two a week. You can keep an eye on us. We have an email newsletter you can sign up for. If you message us, like in the Q&A or in the chat box, you can email the general clerk, Jessica Pierce, directly to get added to that list. Or on social media, we're at WU Film Series on both Twitter and Instagram, and we're at Webster Film Series on Facebook. This is also a good place to keep track of all our coming virtual events. So of course, you're at House by the Cemetery tonight. A week from today, we've got Don't Torture a Duckling with Troy Howard, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But maybe the big news is we're in the process of announcing our May speakers. We've announced it some places, but not every place as of this moment. But the May series is going to be on the Japanese animator Satoshi Kon, who made 4 feature films before he died of pancreatic cancer at age 46. But yeah, the speakers and events for those, right now they're listed. There are Facebook events, but that's about it. They'll be in tomorrow's email blast if you're on the email list, and they'll pop up on Twitter and Instagram and things here relatively shortly, probably next week. Anyway, we've got a couple of sponsors for the April Fulcis series. The first one is Messed Up Puzzles, who are the Messed Up Puzzles guy has long been a friend of mine, so I was happy to get them on board for this. But Messed Up Puzzles has donated 2 puzzles just as registration prizes. So if you are here, you register and you attend, you're automatically registered to win one. If you do win, you can pick any in-stock Fulci puzzle. So assuming things don't change, your options will be the New York Ripper, Zombie, and the Beyond. We're going to pick those winners a week from tomorrow, probably. So if anybody in the audience right now wins, more likely than not, you'll hear from me a week from tomorrow. And then our other sponsors, Left Bank Books over in the Central West End. The film series and Left Bank Books has collaborated on events for at least 36 years, maybe longer. But I was happy again to work with them on this. They made a page for many of the books that our April Fulcis speakers have written. It's under the book club section under events if you're looking for it later. This is left-bank.com. But then if you scroll toward the bottom, you've got the listings. Kia Wilson, the first speaker in April Fulcis, her novel We Eat Our Own is discounted for this month only as part of this series. And we've got a copy of her novel to give away that I'll be announcing a week from tomorrow as well. And then Dr. H.C.'s couple of books, and then Troy Howard, the next speaker next week. So regarding Troy Howard the next week, this is the penultimate April Fulcis event. Next week is Don't Torture a Duckling, which is the earliest Fulci film that we're featuring. And then the speaker is Troy Howard, who wrote a biography of Fulci, Splintered Visions, which is available on that Left Bank Books page. And he's also written a whole bunch. Hey, Aaron's got it too. We're Troy Howard fanboys. But yeah, he wrote a lot of other books too on Mario Bava and John Carpenter and Giallo and Wogjali in general, all kinds of other things. But yeah, he's recorded over 75 audio commentaries. He's very well qualified, and we've all been very much looking forward to his event. So be sure to come back next week for Troy on Don't Torture a Duckling. One last thought before I hand over the floor to Aaron is that Aaron's presentation is going to be 35 or 40 minutes, somewhere in that neighborhood. When he's done, we'll do a discussion with the audience. So if you have questions at any time, feel free to plop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Generally speaking, that's what draws my attention the best. I'll be relaying the questions to Aaron. So yeah, put them in the Q&A box. If you put them in the chat, I'll probably see them too, but I'm more likely to miss them in chat than I am in Q&A. Also, Aaron likes to have discussions with people. He's more social than a lot of us, maybe. But if you want to speak your question, if you want to hit the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, we can ask to activate your microphone at that point, and then you can just speak your question and maybe have like a dialogue with Aaron instead of doing that kind of robotic, like you type something and then I read it to Aaron and then Aaron responds and then you type something else. So feel free, if you want to actually engage verbally, raise hand. And we can't turn your camera on either, so don't worry about your camera coming on and us seeing your messy bedroom or whatever's going on your side. So all that said, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Aaron. I'll hand the floor over to you.
All right, there we go. Sorry, I had to get my presentation up and rolling. Can you see it? I hope someone's nodding. So thanks, Pete. Thanks to the Webster University Film Series for having me. And thanks most of all for all of you who came to hear me tell you tonight why I think that Lucio Fulci is a real master of horror, and how The House by the Cemetery is a pretty unique addition to his filmography up to that point. It combines the willing narrative convolutions of his previous two films with a commitment to creating a sense of terror that is in the service of the film's plot. I decided for this talk to concentrate mostly on my own observations and don't spend a lot of time with elements you can find easily elsewhere, but I did consult a variety of excellent resources, and I'll make a list of them available at the end. Oops. Got a problem. There we go. Hopefully you've been here for the previous two talks and know all about the City of the Living Dead and the beyond from those excellent presentations. But to recap, those two films and this one have become known in the popular consciousness as the Gates of Hell trilogy. Now, some people will tell you that this is thanks to each having a gate to another dimension, sort of, and containing one or more zombies, sort of. However, if you spend any time at all with these films, you'll find that they don't really share many common story elements. They are connected by time. Fulci made all three of them in around 10 months, from July of 1980 to May of 1981. They're also connected by having a similar cast and similar crew members. But they're most notably similar in their expression of a sort of pure cinema that commits more to the evocation of emotion than the telling of a coherent story. Fulci's critics often use this commitment to confounding logic in these films as an indication of his inability to tell a story coherently, but in fact, this was by design. The goal of this confounded logic, as we will see, is to create a sense of pure horror in the audience. The approach in the first two was to rely on convoluted logic that twisted the details of the plot, dropping horrific moments onto the audience with little warning. By contrast, House by the Cemetery uses its convoluted logic in service of the plot, creating terror before showing you the horror. Now, at this point, you might be asking, so what the heck is the difference between horror and terror? Well, that's an outstanding question, imaginary questioner. Terror is the feeling of dread and apprehension at the possibility of experiencing something frightening. Horror, on the other hand, is the shock and repulsion of actually seeing the frightening thing. So the way I talk about it is this. It's a dark and stormy night. The lights suddenly blink out, and a minute later you hear a faint scratching at the door, which grows louder and more insistent. You conjure a million mental images about what's on the other side of that door, and that's terror. When you finally screw up the courage to open the door and you find a multidimensional shape-shifting monster on the other side and lose control of your bladder as you realize that it just finished consuming your most beloved pet and is now oozing across the threshold at you, that's horror. So the next question is, says who? Well, I don't know how many of you know the name Anne Radcliffe, but in the 1790s, she was basically J.K. Rowling, the most popular author of her day who helped popularize the Gothic romantic novel as well as legitimize it. She sometimes wrote in reaction to other Gothic authors. Notably, her novel, The Italian, was written in response to Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk, as Radcliffe felt it relied too much on horror and not enough on terror. This may seem a semantic distinction to you, but to Anne Radcliffe and to many others, it was and is a fundamental issue. It wasn't published in her lifetime, but Radcliffe's essay on the supernatural in poetry outlines her thinking on the matter. And here's a quote: "Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them." So there is a distinction, and it goes back 200 years, and it's still pretty common in the discussion of literary horror. Now, one thing that really distinguishes Fulci was that he often leapt completely over terror and went straight to horror in the previous two films. Following the logic of dreams, where you often find yourself plopped directly into some situation where events are already occurring with people whose motivations can be hard to read, the first two films dive into situations head first without much to establish context. House by the Cemetery, on the other hand, actually spends some time establishing the background for what will unfold and also goes deeper into character than City of the Living Dead or The Beyond. For example, we know that Norman Boyle, played by Paolo Malco, is an academic with a research interest that leads him to Boston to continue the work of a colleague whose own work was inconveniently interrupted when he committed a murder-suicide. Catriona MacColl takes her third and final turn as a star of a Fulci film as Lucy Boyle. We know that Lucy isn't thrilled with leaving New York and eventually discovered that she's been medicated for mental and or emotional troubles in the past. We find that Bob, played by Giovanni Frezza, is an active little boy who loves playing with cars. Now, comparatively, that's a lot of character development for Fulci and screenwriter Dardano Sacchetti, who collaborated on all three Gates of Hell films at this stage in their careers. But as I said earlier, there's a lot here that is purposefully contradictory and even nonsensical. And that nonsense, in addition to Massimo Lentini's excellent production design on the house itself, is actually what manufactures much of the overall sense of terror in the film. Now, this unpredictability was a part of the previous two films, certainly. But in the previous two films, it was the horror itself that was mostly unpredictable. The random maggot hurricane and the sudden head drilling in City of the Living Dead, or the tarantula attack and the literal chemical face peel in The Beyond are good examples. In these films, the horror often arrives unprovoked and out of nowhere. In The House by the Cemetery, however, the horror is always motivated by elements in the plot. However, there's a commitment to elements that destabilize the predictability of the characters that adds a similar sense that anything might happen. All three films use the nonsensical and the out of place to create the emotional state Fulci is trying to manufacture in the audience. But the first two rely almost completely on horror, whereas this film, they try to build a foundation out of terror to destabilize audience expectations. Now, one of my favorite destabilizing moments in the film is when Agent Laura Gittleson, played by Italian genre star Dagmar Lysander, first takes the Boyle family to the titular house. So watch this.
Damn tombstones.
Damn tombstones? Was it the fault of the tombstones that she drove over them? Consider for a second the sociocultural implications of driving over tombstones where, actual human beings are buried. Does it seem appropriate with other people watching to be mad about stones memorializing the dead getting in the way of your carelessness? It very much doesn't. But my contention is that Fulci does things like this to throw his audience off balance. And this is a particularly off-balance little occurrence that is received in a perfectly off-balanced way. Watch how these two observe the grave desecration and their reaction to it. Do they look at each other and at least frown? Do they discuss Gittleson's appalling carelessness and callousness?
Well, house in the woods. Quiet.
You're right.
Not at all. Their response is just as bizarre as the activity that preceded it, maybe a little more so. And the whole thing, as far as the plot is concerned, is unnecessary, it's bizarre, it's illogical. That it's in the film says it's there by design. And so if it is, Fulci had to want it in the film. And the question, obviously, is why? And the only answer that makes sense to me is that it upsets expectations and challenges norms with the intention specifically of making the audience uncomfortable. Another moment that upsets conventions, after Gittleson is killed, Lucy cheerfully happens upon Anne, the babysitter, cleaning up the massive river of blood left behind. We start that sequence with a close-up of the blood on the floor, so we know it's visible. Do they discuss it? Does Lucy say, "Gee, Anne, nice of you to mop up all that human blood from the floor. By the way, why is it there?" Does Anne say, "Good morning, Lucy. I'll get to Bob shortly, but first I was wondering if you had any idea how this clear evidence of a recent murder got all over literally everything?" None of the above. Instead, they each remain silent about what she's doing and instead exchange pleasantries, though Anne is obviously feeling some trepidation. So is it a question of perception? Can Lucy not see the blood for some reason? Does Anne know there was a killing? Is she in on it somehow? We're sure led to believe that she must be, and yet she loses her life to Dr. Freudstein just like his other victims. This scene where we think we know what's going to happen, that Anne will somehow be implicated in the horrors in the basement, is confounded brutally by her utterly visceral murder later. Now, speaking of Anne, there's this scene. Fulci's well-documented interest in eyes finds most of its expression in The House by the Cemetery in this scene and in subsequent scenes with the babysitter Anne. That he focuses on their eyes so completely suggests that they share some sort of secret. And I've seen others suggest that this scene and the others where Norman is accused of having previously visited the town only to sheepishly deny it proves that Anne and Norman were having an affair. But I personally prefer to chalk it up to another moment where Fulci puts two characters into a situation that would suggest one outcome and instead provides the audience with no answer at all. In this situation, we might expect Norman to begin a tirade, asking her why she's prying away the board from the cellar door, but instead she says nothing, while Anne's expression drifts between terrified, defiant, and maybe a little aroused. So is this just bad storytelling? Is Fulci inept? I've read enough reviews that say that he must be, that question his ability, and even call him senile. So is he just phoning it in here? Well, cinematographer Sergio Salvati answers that with an emphatic no. He says that instead of that, on set, Fulci helped them, the crew, told them stories, and even insulted people who laughed because he wanted silence when we filmed in the cellar and such. He believed that he was telling a serious story, one that should scare you, give you a certain feeling, disturb you mentally and emotionally. The House by the Cemetery had to explode out of every single frame, explode with a certain feeling. And that is Fulci's whole point here, to create a singular emotional experience. And if that means the narrative suffers, so be it. Unfortunately, some Americans seem to get frustrated by this narrative playfulness and dismiss it as an example of style over substance. So I thought it might be useful to take just a moment and talk about some influences that contributed to this approach to cinema. Because enjoying European horror often means being confronted by this approach, which can be difficult for folks who grew up watching movies in America. Popular American literature and art has generally followed a trend towards realism, and its cinema has been an outgrowth of that trend. But European film was born at roughly the same time as some very influential artistic and literary movements that intended to challenge realism, which have had a huge impact there. Expressionism, which was born at the dawn of the 20th century, was a movement that started in poetry and painting and would eventually deeply influence European cinema. Expressionism was a reaction against materialism and realism and wanted to create for its audience expressions of an emotional experience rather than present the facts surrounding that experience. Expressionists were worried about general truths as experienced subjectively more than reactions to experiences viewed from outside the person experiencing them. They tended to use symbolic types more than fully realized characters, with an emphasis on their inner worlds and their affective experience of that world. When we think of Expressionism as it relates to cinema, we may think of a particular style, thanks to the enormous influence of the production design of Herman Worm for Robert Wiener's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But that style is not itself the only way to think of Expressionism. Other famous expressionists created very different sorts of styles, such as this one. This is George Gross's Café. It's also my favorite painting. The point of this painting is not to deliver an expertly recreated snapshot of a cafe. It's to help us feel the seediness of the cafe and its characters. And in fact, realism is purposefully sacrificed to deliver that feeling. And I show you this one in particular because it was this work of expressionism that unlocked this secret for me. It's part of the permanent collection of the St. Louis Art Museum, and standing in front of it years ago, I was overcome by a feeling. My mind stopped trying to figure out what it said, and instead this sense of aliveness of the painting just washed over me, and I suddenly got it. The point isn't to figure it out, it's to feel it. Or to put it another way, if you feel something when you view it, you figured it out. Think about it. You don't rave to your friends about a new deli you just tried because their sandwiches are particularly well conceptualized. You don't line up for a third go on the roller coaster at the amusement park because of the sensitivity of its construction. Those are things you might also research and enjoy, but the point is the experience, the emotion that you feel. Expressionism was enormously influential, not just on painting, but as noted on films such as the aforementioned Dr. Caligari, F.W. Murnau's Frankenstein from 1922, and Fritz Lang's Metropolis from 1935. And though Fulci himself would not likely count them as necessarily expressionistic, all three of his Gates of Hell films would very much follow the fundamental idea of expressionism, emphasize an emotion at the expense of realism. At around the same time as Expressionism came to fruition, Surrealism was springing up in Europe. Works of Surrealism are specifically about surprise and work to confound aesthetic, thematic, and narrative expectations in their audience. Sound familiar? From a cinematic perspective, and from Fulci's, this is probably best exemplified by Louis Buñuel's 1929 surrealist film Un Chien Andalou, a plotless series of disconnected and hallucinatory events that were taken from dreams shared between the director and his co-writer, the painter Salvador Dali. Surrealism reminds us that narrative is only one possible option for cinema, and another was this sort of Freudian free association. Also, its most well-known scene, the slicing of Simone Muriel's eyeball, certainly influenced Fulci. Fulci talked a lot about Buñuel. In Europe, the foundational ideas of expressionism and surrealism worked their way into the fabric of filmmaking, producing works that often eschewed logic in favor of emotional spectacles. So the point is that all three of these films are operating in a way that has a philosophical underpinning that's been pretty common in European cinema. And really, horror is a perfect place for this kind of emotional focus and embracing of the illogical. If you think about it for a second, a lot of popular horror is already illogical and emotionally focused. I mean, think of it. Men who drink blood to stay alive and turn into bats and mists? How about a drowned little boy who becomes a mute, unstoppable backwoods killing machine who eventually visits Manhattan, hell, and space? Strangely, horror fans seem fine with those deviations of logic, but find the ones in European cinema hard to stomach. But The House by the Cemetery uses its deviations from the central plot in the service of that plot. So then how do we interpret what's there? Why is it this way, and what is Fulci up to? Well, I think that the crux of it is to see this film as an attempt by the director and his collaborators to channel the emotional experience of a terrified child. And this isn't my invention. It's clearly stated by screenwriter Dardano Sacchetti in an interview when he said, "The story reflects my childhood and Elisa's experience as a child psychologist channeling a children's world." Elisa, by the way, is his wife, Elisa Briganti, who also received a story credit on the film. He continues, "Be it for what they dreamed, what they fantasized, or what they saw or interpreted a certain way, for me, kids have always been the key, the password between the adult world and the rest, between reality and metaphysics. It is my contention that fear is the strongest in childhood, and this film intends to remind us of the actual feeling of that fear. This is a child's emotional landscape, and the horror that Fulci is creating here is born of realizing that every one of your primal childhood fears is real. The thing under your bed is hunting you, and mommy and daddy can't help." The film presents adults who are self-obsessed, slow to respond to danger, inept, and ultimately helpless. And Fulci uses the terror of being in a world with unreliable adults as the foundation for the film's horror. Let's talk about Norman. As a father, his traditional role is as protector, and he generally does a pretty bad job of that. Repeatedly, when a danger rears its head, Norman doesn't act immediately. When he's sitting at his desk and hears what sounds very much like Bob whimpering and crying, instead of leaping to his feet to investigate what's happening, he sits there, listening, like for a while. The idea that your father hears you in distress and doesn't immediately respond trips a primal childhood fear. and Norman does this several times. When Lucy is sobbing after finding the Freudstein grave in the house, he clearly hears it but doesn't respond immediately. And when the bat is initially attacking Lucy, Fulci cuts to Norman, who is frozen, just watching her be attacked. Norman constantly hesitates when there's danger, which creates a sense that at any time he might make a decision other than one to help. Norman also doesn't seem to understand how danger works. When it comes time to try to pry open the locked door to the basement, he uses a sharp kitchen knife a foot or two from Bob's face as a pry bar, possibly the single most dangerous way to go about that. When Bob is being attacked by Freudstein on the other side of the same cellar door, Norman's instinct is to swing the hatchet at exactly Bob's head height. Now, he does tell Bob to stand back, but he could easily chop above his 3.5-foot tall son's head, but he doesn't, and he almost kills him repeatedly. Twice in the film, people suggest that he's been to the town before, and both times he looks sheepish, guilty, and completely uncomfortable. And this is never resolved. It feels like it exists just to create a doubt in the audience, as we, the audience, are viewing the film from Bob's emotional perspective. And so we experience a father who is bizarrely untrustworthy. Lucy isn't quite so problematic, but her own capacity to slide into hysterics does create an unstable feeling in the film. When she screams about Bob leaving things all over the house all the time, we don't really see evidence of that elsewhere. That the ire is directed at Bob and that he's in earshot when it happens indicates that Lucy has a tendency to take out her emotions on other people. That creates a distance between she and her son, though paradoxically, she's the one that clings to Bob most. The sense of separation between parents and children is illustrated visually in the first scene of Bob with a parent. Here, Salvati and Fulci went with a rack focus that allows only one or the other subject to be clearly resolved at a time, suggesting a separation between the world of the parent and the world of the child. Fulci seemed to understand separation as terrifying, as the characters in this film spend a lot of time looking for other characters. Watch this.
Steve? Are you there? Bob, where are you? Bob! Where's... Bob? Anne? Bob? Anne? Bob! Anne?
Lucy?
Mrs. Boyle? Anne? Anne? Bob! Where are you? Come on, quit playing. Bob? Anne? 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 Bob? Anne? Bob? Anne? Bob? Anne? Mommy says you're not dead. Anne? You there? Mommy! 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 Bob? Bob?
It's not just Fulci that understands this sense of separation anxiety. Ray Jacobson at the Child Mind Institute writes that the most common childhood fear is of being alone. And this is echoed by child therapist Natasha Daniels, who's also written several books on the subject of childhood anxiety, including one on separation anxiety. That people are constantly looking for each other throughout this film suggests that this is an example of Fulci trying to establish this sense of separation and aloneness throughout the film.
Steve?
It's playing again for some reason. In addition to separation, child psychologists also agree about some other important things that children fear around Bob's age, and they all appear here. Fear of monsters? Check. Fear of the dark? Check. Fear of loud or scary noises? Check. Fear of animals, 100%. Fear of the supernatural, you bet. Fear of going to the doctor, Dr. Freudstein, check. In fact, the whole list of things that children around Bob's age are afraid of, the majority appears somewhere in the film. Not necessarily to Bob, but around Bob. Let's talk about Bob. Specifically, the most common criticism leveled at the film. Bob is irritating, or Bob's voice is irritating specifically. The conventional wisdom you hear almost everywhere is that they cut a corner somewhere when they hired the person to do the English language dub, and that's the reason that he's so irritating. However, I think that the voice is on purpose. Bob's voice is grating, but you'll notice that it's also mixed louder than the other voices in the film generally. I think this is yet another way that the filmmakers create an uncomfortable experience for the audience. Nails on the chalkboard that grind away at our nerves, so we're completely frazzled when the horror hits. Another common criticism of the film is the number of times someone says Bob in the film. So thanks to our previous guest, Aaron Christensen, challenging me, I went and counted, and the word Bob is said in the film 37 times, which works out to once every 2.5 minutes. Once by Mary Freudstein, twice by Anne, 3 times by May Freudstein, 5 times by Norman, and the rest, the whopping 26 times by Lucy. And so on to the horror, which is again the whole point. Creating terror is in the service of the horror for Fulci, and it's something that he does really well. Now, the scene with the bat is incredibly long, horrifyingly primal, and completely visceral. And just when you think it can't get any worse, it does, over and over and over again. The fact that nobody's ever in danger of losing their life makes it pretty unique as well. A friend of mine in high school related a story to me about getting jammed in a cave when he was a kid and having bats swarm all around him, getting stuck in his hair and on his clothes. And that story still gives me the willies. Bats carry a lot of social stigma. They're popularly known as carriers of disease, and the Christian Bible even calls them unclean in at least 2 places, surprise, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So the scene is partially about the horror of touching an unclean thing, but Fulci cranks it up a notch by making it actually attack Norman. And of course, then there's the stabbing, which causes blood to come out of the stab wound in the bat and a couple of other places besides to make it even more horrifying. And as horrifying as all that is, it seems like the whole point of the scene, to me, is for Bob to see it, and specifically for Bob to be physically touched by the horror. In this case, the blood of the bat commingled with the blood of his father. Earlier, I made a joke about a carefully constructed roller coaster, but I gotta say, Fulci constructs a pretty amazing roller coaster ride, so I thought we might dig into some of the things specifically that make his horror so effective. The scene where Laura Gittleson is killed is a really great example. In 1981, when the film's made, we are right in the middle of the slasher film craze with its single-touch gimmicky kills. Think, for example, of the shotgun exploding Savini's head in Maniac, or Mr. Garrett, the security guard from Halloween 2, getting a claw hammer in the head. But here Fulci takes a lot of time with the kill, a 3-stab version, and we see each excruciating penetration of the poker and her reactions, culminating in the next stab that produces a geyser of blood. Interestingly, this film has no massive eye trauma, but makeup effects artist Gino De Rossi remembers shooting one for this scene. And when we see Freudstein dragging her body, it's clear that the eye's gone, but the scene was actually cut. De Rossi guesses it was thanks to the distributors, but I couldn't find any solid evidence of why it's not in the film. I'd love to hear if anybody knows why. Dr. Freudstein's a place where Fulci's pure horror becomes thematic in a way. Fulci made his hostility towards psychiatry known pretty well in his films. When characters from A Lizard in a Woman's Skin or City of the Living Dead, or especially A Cat in the Brain, visit psychiatrists, whatever's wrong in their lives becomes significantly worse. So the fact that our antagonist is called Dr. Freudstein should surprise nobody overmuch. But the name didn't come from Fulci, and according to screenwriter Dardano Sacchetti, it didn't come from him either. The name came from producer Luciano Martino. That said, the idea of a lunatic surgeon who becomes obsessed with his own work to the point of experimenting on himself to catastrophic and horrifying outcomes certainly seems to line up with Fulci's feelings about the motivations and outcomes of those involved in psychiatry. That Sacchetti and Fulci also allude to a mental illness in Lucy, one which Norman keeps trying to solve with psychoactive medications that appear not to help very much, creates another riff on this idea in the film. Speaking of Freudstein, I think that the film's most horrific moments are not necessarily the ones that take place during an active killing, but during the time where we listen to the tape left by Dr. Peterson and are treated to a montage of utterly horrifying images of rotting human body parts and eviscerated children. And instead of seeing the activities that cause this carnage, instead we hear it under the tortured narration. This technique of hearing the act of murder while viewing the results would be used to really great effect 5 years later in John McNaughton's grim Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. My personal opinion is that people don't give Fulci the credit that he deserves as a creator of cinema and a master of its tools and techniques. As a maker of film and video myself, one of the things that really interests me is how a director handles movement inside the frame across time, which is to say how screen rhythms help create narrative and affect. And I think that the first set piece murder of the film is a real masterclass in the rhythm of screen movement, and is not only why it's such a successful horror scene, but why it's also so symbolically important to the film overall. So let's take a second and watch it, and then we can pick it apart, and then we'll watch it again. We begin on this really nice close-up of Daniela Doria, an actress who Fulci killed repeatedly in several films, including this one, City of the Living Dead, and The New York Ripper. In this shot, we get a cue that something's happening off to screen right by her eye movement tracing that direction. Once she commits to looking left, Fulci and cinematographer Sergio Salvati use that head turn and her eye line specifically to create what's called an index vector, which basically means a thing on screen that points to something else. They use that index vector to open up the frame, pulling back and panning to the right, with the on-screen elements pulling the viewer's eye up a bit to reveal her brutally murdered boyfriend. So we're up and to the right. This is where my computer tries to lag. Then they don't cut into a close-up of scissors protruding from his body. Fulci and Salvati zoom into it. Let's pause for a second and talk about the American attitude about zooms, because if you read much about its use, the zoom's use by American critics, you see that it's not held in very high regard. And the question is why? And the answer, I think, is the same reason that we tend to sniff at films that are purposefully narratively incoherent. We simply don't see a lot of zooms in American films. Zooms are an inherently mechanical way to move inside the film frame and draw some attention to the artifice of filmmaking in that we see something of the camera's lens mechanics when it happens. That said, there's a real efficiency in using the zoom this way, creating a seamlessness in the frame that doesn't require the expense and complication of setting up a dolly or a whole other camera setup. I think Salvati and camera operator Franco Bruni here create a pretty compelling suggestion that the zoom can be done in a way that's poetic and also impactful. But the decision to do it this way was clearly Fulci's, as close-ups of the killing blow are absolutely his stock in trade. Now, editor Vincenzo Tomasi holds the shot just long enough for a single drop of blood to fall from the scissors before he cuts back to a different close-up of Doria and gives us one frame before her frantic screaming starts, again motivating a zoom in to emphasize. This GIF is playing back terribly, isn't it? Her second scream motivates another camera move. Again, following that initial index vector, it moves up and to the right to a point above her head where a knife is being held. Again, in the previous two shots, the camera moves up and to the right along the index vector first indicated by Doria's character's eye line. Now the index vector is changed, and the point of the knife defines a new trajectory for screen movement, answering with the opposite of up and to the right, down and to the left. And whereas before the movement in the frame was the movement of the camera, it's here counterbalanced by becoming the movement of the actors. So the knife slashes down predictably along the trajectory of the knife point. Now we cut, and again, Tomasi holds for one frame before the knife enters the shot from the upper right, falling along that same trajectory outlined previously. Of course, the knife punches into her skull, and the hideous sound made by engineer Ugo Solani is one of the grosser murder noises I can think of. Here we go. I don't think you heard it well enough. Let's do it again. This presentation is not for the squeamish. Then we cut to her face, where the knife continues along the path outlined by its initial vector to its horrifying conclusion, popping out of her mouth. Once more, we punch into a close-up of the knife protruding from her mouth, and Doria falls from the frame along the same trajectory defined by the knife point. Each time, Fulci punches into the instrument to emphasize it. Finally, we see her hit the ground, dead on impact, with the knife pointing out that same index vector from the upper right to the lower left of the screen. This time, the knife is an arrow pointing to the ring, and in case you weren't sure that was his intent, we get one more potent zoom to bring you closer to the ring, which will reappear later when Norman reopens the cellar. Symbolically, the entire killing has been packed into that ring by the balanced and carefully punctuated rhythms created by Fulci and his collaborators, and so it functions as a way to let you know that when the cellar's unlocked, the murders will begin anew. So let's watch it all the way through again and look at how the actions leading up to the killing of the girl are following one kind of rhythmic logic, and how the actual killing blow and final disposition of the body answer it with equal and opposite screen rhythms. I mentioned that at the end, I'd share some resources. So first, if you're only going to own one book about Fulci, we already talked about this one, but I recommend that it be Troy Howarth's Splintered Visions. It is no joke that I open it every time I watch a Fulci film, and we're really lucky to have him here next week. If you're going to own two of them, Beyond Terror by Stephen Thrower is also really, really good. Spaghetti Nightmares is a series of interviews with Italian horror filmmakers, including Fulci and a bunch of other people. And the Blue Underground Blu-ray limited edition is really the gold standard for this film, and it's packed with special features that go deeply into the making of the film. And there's also a 4K version of this. I'd also mention that there is an upcoming issue of Horror Hound magazine that'll be out this year that's all about Italian horror. And if you'd like to read an excellent retrospective of Fulci's The Beyond by John Kitley, you should pick that up too. If you don't know John, he runs kitleyscrypt.com, one of the longest running websites about horror on the internet, and he knows more about horror than any of us, but is kind enough to share. If you want to learn something, go check out his site and pick up this magazine, which will also feature a retrospective on Dario Argento's Suspiria, written by yours truly. The presentation I'd originally planned was actually twice this long, as I have a lot to say about this little film, but I obviously am not allowed to have that much time to irritate you with my opinions and theories. So instead, I'll just leave it with this. Fulci is rightly known as a director of visceral horror, and hopefully I've given you some food for thought as to why and how he pulls it off, and maybe even encouraged you to see his more narratively challenging films, not as an affront, but as a real attempt to create a feeling of horror in you. After all, that's the point, isn't it? As we fans are prone to say, and Andy ended with last week, Fulci lives. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I'll remind everybody, please do put your questions in the Q&A box, or if you put them in the chat, I'll probably see them, or you can raise your hand and we'll ask to turn on your microphone and you can just speak them. But before we get into any questions, I owe Aaron an apology. It's my favorite hobby to forget to say something important and then spend the whole presentation being mad at myself for forgetting to say the important thing. But I didn't really introduce Aaron basically at all. It's like, okay, here's Aaron. It's just like, you all know Aaron. I've known Aaron for like 20 years or something. I just sort of assume people know him. If you don't know Aaron, he's the associate dean in the School of Communications. The School of Communications is the school in Webster University that, among other things, houses the film series, not to mention like film and television production, film studies, things like that. So Aaron started at Webster as an adjunct, and he's been like promoted and promoted and promoted again. Basically, at the rate you're going, you're going to be CEO of Webster University by time you retire. But anyway, among other things relevant to the conversation now is he taught the very popular class Grave Tales twice in the past 3 or so years. Grave Tales is a history of the horror film. And I know the first time you taught it, you didn't have Fulci on the syllabus, and the second time you did, which is something I want to come back around to depending on how many questions we get from the audience. But where I wanted to start, I gave warning that there's going to be a question about this last week, so I figured I'd throw it out first. One thing that I find myself coming back to watching Fulci films is he has a tendency to reference things, and I don't always, sometimes I like it and sometimes I don't, but I feel like I almost never really know what he's doing. Like I don't feel like I understand what he's going for. So we talked about that with how Zombie makes references to most especially Jaws, but also like King Kong. And last week we briefly mentioned how The Beyond sort of references The Shining. One thing that didn't come up last week is that the male and female lead in The Beyond are Dr. John McCabe and Liza Merrill. So it's McCabe and Mrs. Merrill. That sounds an awful lot like an Altman movie, but there's always, it seems like there's a lot of stuff like that in Fulci's films. I'm never really clear on how intentional it is there. But yeah, anyway, I think the Shining comparison really, really comes through in House by the Cemetery. There are a lot of things that seem like they might be influenced by The Shining. I've seen some people argue that it's a ripoff of The Shining, which I don't really agree with. But then there's also some allusions maybe to like The Omen and stuff like that. I was wondering if you have opinions. I'm sure you do have opinions. So what are your opinions on like what he's up to with this type of reference? Yeah, I guess, what do you think of all of this?
You know, it's so we talked about European filmmaking, and especially I think Italian, and to another, maybe a little lesser degree, but similarly Spanish filmmaking and genre filmmaking in particular. I feel like, especially around this time, popular music, filmmaking, it was not uncommon. You know, you think of the song House of the Rising Sun, probably best known by the Animals, but there's 10 million versions of that, right? There's different riffs on that song. And it was not uncommon if something got popular in the world of European filmmaking for other directors to riff on it. And I don't think this film shares much in common with The Shining writ large. It pulls some elements out. So it's like, hey, there's a couple of things that were really popular. And this movie, I think, as you talked to me about, Pete, the movie was sort of, these movies were sort of made simultaneously with The Shining. And so it's like, well, how could he know? And it's like, well, Stanley Kubrick, a director whose work is always received very favorably up to that point, is going to make a movie about a very, very popular book. So there's a better than average chance that this is going to float up into the popular consciousness. So why don't we throw some of those elements in our film and make sure that it's, you know, it's received popularly. Now, that said, the elements that are in here that are from The Shining, I think, are kind of interesting. Obviously, there's the fact that Bob can talk to dead kids. But one thing that doesn't get talked about much, and I actually read this somewhere and I hadn't even thought about it, is Norman. That whole little bit about him having been there before is kind of a riff on the Nicholson character being the caretaker who's always been there. Which I think is really interesting. But I really think the film is populated by flavors of other films. And I think that's true too. People talk about, I mean, Kia talked about it as well, I believe, with Zombie. You know, there's this conversation that you hear, a shorthand, when people talk about Zombie. It's like, oh yeah, it was a ripoff of other films. It isn't at all. You know, it isn't at all a ripoff of Romero's films. It's not anything like Romero's films. In fact, as I think she talked about, and as a lot of people talk about, it's much more like the zombie films of the 40s, you know, some of the much, much earlier zombie films, which are set in the Gulf of Mexico and, you know, Haiti and the Dominican Republic and things like that. So I just think it's kind of lazy. And whenever people say that they're ripoffs specifically, I would call them riffs. I would call them, you know, here's my version of your hit song.
All right. Well, thanks. I see questions are starting to come in, but I've got other ones, so I'll come back to the other questions first. I'm sorry. There's at least one that I wanted to get out that's been sort of a burning question for me as I've been doing this work. Oh, and we've got a hand up too. Look at all this. You're so engaged, everybody. Okay, so I'll come back to the audience questions momentarily, but I did want to come back. You talked about Dr. Freudstein and how, like, the origins of his names and how Fulci had problems with psychologists and things like that. You see a lot. I mean, like, you don't have to do much in the way of horror studies at all to see Ed Gein come up. You know, Ed Gein was an influence on Leatherface and Norman Bates and Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs and stuff like that. I'm wondering if you have knowledge of the creation of Freudstein in that way. He seems to have kind of Gein-like elements, but I have my own theory. So yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts, and then I might throw my opinion at you depending on what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I don't know much about that. It's one of those things where, well, first of all, if you listen to them talk, Sacchetti and Fulci couldn't agree on anything in interviews, so and Sacchetti has the benefit of still being alive and able to answer questions, whereas Fulci's been dead for 20 years. And so consequently, it's hard to say who was responsible for what exactly, and it's hard to say how Fulci felt about Freudstein or how much he had. I can't find much that talks about the design of that character from his perspective. But as I talked about, he definitely had real serious reservations about psychiatry in particular. He didn't like the prescriptiveness of it. He didn't like the fact that it was that it sort of dictated to other people what was going on inside their own minds, and he thought it was baloney. And so I don't know who was most responsible for the creation of the character exactly, how much influence they had. But as I mentioned, I really think that Fulci must have been delighted by the idea of putting together Frankenstein and Freud, because that pretty well sums up his feelings about, at least his published feelings about the science of psychiatry.
Well, my question, like I said, I had a strong reading myself, and I haven't seen it reflected anywhere. So I was curious if you have seen this in your own reading about the film. So yeah, Freudstein is of course a combination between Sigmund Freud and Frankenstein, and it makes sense in the context of the character. That sounds like kind of generic Jew name to me, Freudstein. Like you would assume that this is a Jewish character, and here he's terrorizing very Aryan-looking people. I feel like Bob and Lucy are kind of like the most Aryan. Like they're so. I guess Catriona MacColl is sort of green-eyed, but Bob is very blue-eyed and very blonde, and Catriona MacColl is very blonde and sort of close to blue-eyed. Have you come across this? I feel like, I don't think it was intentional, but I feel like it's really easy to read it as being anti-Semitic.
As being anti-Semitic? That's
Yeah.
interesting, because it sounds, I mean, the way that you set it up, it almost sounds like the revenge of the Jewish people on the Aryan people rather than an anti-Semitic riff. That wasn't how you thought of it, huh?
Not really, yeah. It kind of did. So I didn't think, the first time I saw this film, I didn't think that at all. It was more of a like, oh, it's cool when they stab the anthropomorphic fudgesicle and maggots come out. Like that was my big take on it the first time. But yeah, the second time it did kind of have the vibe of like if you watched a movie now and it had like black cops killing like white people in traffic stops. I kind of got that from it.
Yeah, I haven't encountered anything about that. That's the first time that I think I've encountered that. There's a really interesting article out there that is referenced in the booklet that comes with the Blue Underground Blu-ray of the film, and it's online. And I wish that I had put a link up to it, but it goes into a little bit of Freudstein. But I don't remember them talking about that in particular. So I like your take. I think it's interesting, but I haven't read it. I haven't come across it myself. There you go. You got a paper you can write, Pete.
All right, yeah. No, like I said, I didn't really get the impression that it was intentional, but it did seem like it was right there too, and I was surprised that I hadn't seen it mentioned anywhere. Okay, so that's my question for now. I've got others, but we've got so many. So Charles Jacobson wants to know, what is the major difference between Fulci terror/horror and Hitchcock terror/horror? Does Hitchcock do actual horror?
That's a really interesting question, because I would say that Hitchcock almost relies completely on terror. I mean, he's the master of suspense most of the time, right? So he really lives on the other side of that equation. So you think about Psycho, it's like, how much do we actually see? I mean, the amount of horror that we actually see is when we, spoiler alert, turn Mother's body around, right? Like when we're actually given the resolution to the story, and almost everything else in that film lives on the other side of that line. So I would say that's the big difference. And I think that's why. So what I didn't get into in my presentation is that there's that kind of dichotomy, and there's that line crossing mentality that happens all the time, where people talk about how, oh, I don't like, that kind of horror. And what they mean is the kind of horror that crosses the line into being actually horror. And what I think that really attracts people about Fulci, and it's the reason why so many people like Fulci who still find his narrative suspect, is just that he's so committed to jumping in with both feet into the horror side of it, that people who are huge horror fans can't get enough of that.
We had a question from Joshua Ray. Josh, I'm going to try to, well, I think I have to give you permission to turn your own mic on, so I'm going to do that now.
Hi there, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
I wanted to ask, last year I went through and just like did a bunch of Fulci back to back to back, and circling around, I was really excited to get into talking about these films, but in my memory, I'm having a difficult time distinguishing between them. And I don't really say that because they have some similarities between them, because really their plots aren't similar. They have similar actors across the different casts. But I'm wondering if, a few of you have talked about the kind of effect of Fulci's filmmaking being like a nightmare. I'm wondering if there's anything to that, and if you can kind of talk about your own experience in watching Fulci. Does anyone have that kind of phenomena happening with them?
So you mean just a subjective experience, my own personal experience?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, well, so an interesting thing about me is that I don't often find horror horrific. I find it enthralling. I find it exciting. So my experience is I like people who push boundaries. So Fulci was always attractive to me because I liked that he was a director who was unafraid to, like I said, jump into the horror side of things with both feet. The stuff that he created was unapologetically horrifying and disgusting, and I just thought that was outstanding. For me, it was always sort of like, how much can I stand? It's a roller coaster of terrifying proportions, and can I get on and can I stay for the whole ride without closing my eyes? So that was kind of it for me. I think everybody's experience is different. I certainly think, though, that Fulci's personality was kind of, if you read much about him, he liked to make people uncomfortable sometimes. He clearly enjoyed, on set, he would rant and rave and throw fits a lot. And, he made actresses cry notoriously a lot. But everybody who knew him said he was shy, intellectual, well-mannered. So there was some sort of delight in there for just sort of pushing people's buttons. And I feel like that's part of it. And I really think that's where a lot of that dream logic comes from. I think in some ways he knew he was developing a bit of an American following, and he knew it pissed people in America off. And that delighted him a little bit, that he was going to make people upset with his films. As silly as that sounds to say, he had the audience. I really think that he kind of knew, like, okay, people are going to watch this anyway, so let's screw around with him.
We're actually coming up on the end of the allotted time. I hope you're not in a hurry to go anywhere, Aaron, because I've got a bunch more questions for you. Let me know if at any point you need me to stop asking you questions. So next up, we've got Dan Yesbick, our friend Dan. He says, absolutely masterful, exclamation point. Thank you so much, Aaron. I love the associations with Buñuel's surrealism and Fulci's kill scenes and eye trauma. There seems to be a lot of surrealist convulsive beauty in his work generally. So two questions. One, do any other Fulci scenes/sequences seem particularly Buñuel seasoned beyond the eye trauma? And two, do we know if they ever met or shared correspondence? Thanks again for a masterful analysis.
Thank you, Dan. That says a lot, because yours was an outstanding presentation in the it was last month, right? So I would say that the previous two films, I didn't get into this. I kind of broke that off in my presentation. I talk about surrealism mostly because the previous two films follow the logic of, or the anti-logic of surrealism a little bit more. So I think one of the most surrealistic kills in all of Fulci's filmography is the acid scene in The Beyond. It just comes out of nowhere. It makes no sense. I mean, follow the activities that happen. The woman is in the morgue. I can't think of her name right now. She's in the morgue, and she screams, and we cut to the daughter outside, and then we come back, and she runs in, and somehow she's managed to fall on the floor underneath a bottle of acid or base, whichever it is, that is now managed to tumble over and is dropping directly onto her face. And she's not doing anything about it. It's completely lunatic. I think it's one of the most surrealistic scenes in horror, and I love it for that reason. I don't think that there's a lot of particular surrealism in The House by the Cemetery as a contrast. I think that it riffs on that surrealism a little bit, but I think it's a lot more expressionistic. But yeah, I think that The Beyond is a work of it's not pure surrealism by any stretch, because it has a plot, but we could argue that other surrealist films have a plot. Buñuel's later films have kind of a loose plot. I don't know of them ever meeting. I know of them sharing actors and working together with, or I know of Fulci specifically working with people that had worked with Buñuel, but I couldn't find any evidence of them ever meeting.
Just a random aside, it hasn't come up yet, so I thought I'd throw it out. Catriona MacColl, our lead of the last 3 films, she started with Jacques Demy in France, which I feel like that's such a weird leap from Jacques Demy to he's the guy that made like the Umbrellas of Cherbourg and like stuff like that. Anyway,
she had a weird career. I mean, like, she's in all those kinds of movies, and then she comes over and becomes super well known as Fulci's lead actress for the Gates of Hell films, and then, as far as I can tell, doesn't really do another genre film.
So next question is from Ethan Hawker, who is actually presenting next month in Satoshi Kon. He's the 3rd Satoshi Kon speaker.
Nice.
He says, do you feel that some viewers' distaste for Fulci's films is his tendency to linger on acts of violence, as opposed to a more successful director like Argento, who tended to have the camera flinch from acts of violence?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know that I would characterize it that way. As I mentioned, I just wrote an article about Suspiria, and the first kill in Suspiria doesn't flinch at all. As a matter of fact, it goes inside of the victim's body to watch her heart be penetrated by a knife. So I don't know if that's it exactly. I would say the big difference is that Argento makes the kill gorgeous in a lot of his films. It's beautiful, it's well crafted, it's an orchestra. And Fulci makes the kill visceral, and he's a master of that. So I would characterize it a little bit differently, but I think your initial point is exactly right, Ethan. I think that people pull away from him, and people love him for exactly that reason. And that's why I kind of talked about the killing of Laura Gittleson, because it's not just one kind of gimmicky stab or whatever. And same thing's true of the killing of Anne. It's these 3 hard, deep cuts through her throat, and we see every one of them. So I think that's exactly right, and I think it's why people don't like him, and I think it's why some people love him.
One of my questions is actually related to that topic, so I've got a couple more from the audience still. So for those of you watching, to kind of show you how the hamburger is made to a certain extent, we tend to have good crowds for horror events, and Aaron's kind of the resident horror guru at Webster. So I wanted to do a horror director for April, and the first thing I did was I got a hold of Aaron. I was like, hey, I want to do horror for April. Who comes to mind? And you gave me a list of, I think, 3 names, but number 1 was Fulci. And I didn't need any further talking into beyond that. Fulci had a lot of sweet spots for me, one of which is I feel like he's kind of understudied. Like you get a lot of like Argento studies, you get a lot of like Carpenter studies and Romero studies. You don't get so much with Fulci. And then my experience when I've been doing research for these events and just talking to people when they've been going on, it seems like he's no one's favorite horror director. It seems like at best he's always like 2nd favorite or 3rd favorite, something like that. So I'm curious why you think he doesn't reach the level of like fan worship that Argento and Bava and people like that do. And then also I was curious why he was your first pick for this series.
The fan worship one's an interesting one. In a lot of ways, I feel like Fulci liked to confound people's expectations, but that was often, Fulci himself was an intellectual, and I think he was extraordinarily well read. Much like Argento, he'd worked in film criticism, but I just think he kind of delighted sometimes in I think he was very specific. He had one very specific outcome. And you can talk about Argento on a bunch of levels. If you go look at Suspiria or Inferno, the movies that I've been obsessed with lately, there's a lot of stuff packed in there. There's all kinds of elements, German short story, Snow White, the Red Shoes. There's a ton of stuff. There's a ton of ways that you can go at it. Whereas Fulci is just trying to get you in the guts in a lot of ways. And certainly there's ways to talk about it. Like I said, I could talk about it a lot longer, but I think that may be the big distinction. And I forget what the second part of the question was.
Oh, just why he was your first pick.
Exactly your reason, I think, is that I don't feel like enough people take him seriously. I think that often he is, and I don't like it when people try to walk around it, when they try to excuse their liking for it. It's like, well, he's weird, man, but he does a pretty good kill, which is fine. I don't mind how anybody likes to participate in cinema, but I just feel like there's a way to go at it, to look at it in a way that's a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more, stand back and try to see what he's up to. And I just thought it would be interesting to talk about it on a little bit deeper level, to sound really pretentious.
I've got, let's see, a question from the audience. I appreciate that you broke down the logistics of motion, energy, and rhythm of the stabbing scene. One of the things I've noticed about Fulci's consistency so far is how tailored and specific his camera movements are. The camera frequently carries from one person to another, one action to another. It's precise and quick and impressive. Does he use this style across the board in his filmography, or is it isolated to just a few films? How do you think these notable movements and rhythms enhance his work?
You know, I think that one of the things that he did that was really smart is he worked with Sergio Salvati a lot. And I get the feeling from watching the films that on which they collaborated that there was a lot of conversation about that. And I feel like if you look at some of his later films that Salvati wasn't a part of, you see a difference. Now, the guy still really understood screen language, and also, you know, it's a resource intensive process, right? So all of that screen movement requires new camera setups or very specific kinds of camera blocking. It's more expensive to get fancier shots just in general, in time and energy and hiring the people who can do it. But I think that what I've seen, at least, and I certainly haven't seen every single Fulci film. I haven't seen a lot of the stuff that he did before he got into the gialli in the 70s. But I think that there's a consistency, and I do think that generally he strived to get better, especially throughout this period. But I think this period is really one of the high water marks for him creatively. And it's astonishing too. I mean, Argento even makes a joke in an interview that I read of his where he's like, Fulci's problem is he's always making 6 films at one time. I mean, you know, that's another thing. Whereas Argento might take 3 years to make a film. As I said, with these films, all the Gates of Hell films were made in 10 months. So his 4 most famous films, if you include Zombie, were made in about 2 years.
Well, this specific film was actually in front of cameras 40 years ago, right now, 40 years ago today, it was being filmed.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to mention that. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah. I've got 2 more questions, and then we should probably wrap up because we're quite a bit over time as it is. Normally, we like hemorrhage people right at 8, but I don't think we've lost a single one. So good work. So second to last question, Charles Evans says, I agree with the idea that Norman is a riff on The Shining, where he's familiar to the townspeople because of his fate being tied to the house. Do you think this plays into the notion that the family's grim fate seems predetermined?
That's a good question, and I've thought about that quite a bit, because there are a lot of other people who talk about sort of the spirituality of this film and the sense of predestination in this film, and I don't know. You know, I like to play with that one in my head, because we have this voice throughout that says, "You shouldn't have come, Bob. You shouldn't have come, Bob." In May Freudstein, right? So there's this sense of the inevitability of it, but there's also a sense that somebody is trying to tell them not to come. But I think that feeds back to the childhood frustration that kids feel, right? Because the only person that was sensitive enough to hear the voice that could warn them was the person that nobody takes seriously, right? So maybe if I had to give an absolute opinion, I'd say, yeah, I do think that it seems inevitable. But I think one of the genius things about Fulci, like we talked about before, is that he very rarely tells you that. You know, it's much more common for him to infuriate an audience by not telling them something.
All right, our last question is from Alan Trump. Alan says, sorry, I've got a cat distracting me. Alan says, Aaron, previous times I've watched the film, I always assumed Dr. Freudstein was an insane medical doctor or scientist. I should actually go back to my question. I see like a Josef Mengele thing with him. That's part of the reason why I got to thinking about the Jewish sounding name and Aryan victims. Anyway, Aaron, previous times I've watched the film, I always assumed Dr. Freudstein was an insane medical doctor or scientist, but watching it recently, is it possible that he's a doctor of metaphysics, sort of a turn of the century Dr. John Dee? Might he be some sort of neuromancer keeping himself alive through sacrificial murder while his body is still rotted and decayed? Have you read anything about that?
Boy, I haven't, but you know, this is one of those 3 films that is supposed to be during the period where Fulci, or if you listen to Sacchetti, who knows, but that they were Lovecraftian in nature, right? And so that would definitely feed into that logic a little bit more. Now, I will say that I think that you see the character, here he is, I believe he's wearing a surgeon's sort of outfit from an earlier time. I think this, because this coat, this kind of coat is also a chef's coat, and it's got those buttons on it so that if you get blood or gore or something on it, you can switch the side. But that isn't to say that there isn't a magical piece to it. And certainly there's a bunch of people who've talked about the metaphysics of this film. And I thought about going down that avenue, but I really kind of wanted to talk more about the filmmaking piece of it. At the end there, I was kind of on the fence as to whether or not I wanted to go down that avenue or not. So I didn't do a lot of reading about that stuff, but there's certainly material out there that I've seen that talks about it. I haven't seen anybody say anything specifically about him being a doctor of metaphysics, but I know that there's stuff out there so that it might be findable. And I'll go look at my resources that I have. I know Alan, I'll send him a message once I find something.
All right, we're 11 minutes past time, and we're out of questions, at least more or less. So Aaron, thanks again. That was wonderful. Do you have any parting thoughts or anything before I wrap this up?
No, this was great. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for having me. I love talking about this movie, so it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah. So please do come back, everyone, next week. The last April Fulcis event, Troy Howarth, Don't Torture a Duckling. It's going to be a lot of fun. And until then, have a horrific week, I guess. Have a horrific week.
Thanks, everybody.